At 02:41 a.m., under a sky the color of burned steel, Staff Sergeant William Will Dempsey stepped out of the maintenance tent at Forward Operating Depot C-17, 20 miles east of Mortain. Frost clung to the canvas like a second skin, turning each fold into a pale ridge of ice. Diesel fumes lingered in the freezing air, mixing with the metallic sting of cold grease and the faint sour smell of exhausted men who'd been awake too long to notice their own condition. Dempsey blinked slowly, struggling to keep his eyes open as he pushed a wrench into the deep pocket of his oil-stained jacket. He had been awake for 31 hours, maybe more. Time had dissolved into a smear of clattering tracks, sputtering engines, and the desperate mutters of tank crews who knew dawn would bring the German counterattack they weren't ready for. A low rumble echoed from the tree line. American M4A1 Shermans idling in the dark, their engines struggling against the cold. The 32nd Armored Column was supposed to move by first light, but 3 of the leading tanks had the same catastrophic issue. In sub-zero temperatures, their fuel delivery lines locked up, starving the engines and stalling the entire formation. Engineers at Battalion HQ blamed a supply error, a bad batch of fuel, maybe even sabotage, but Dempsey had seen the same failure twice already that week. Frost forming in the auxiliary line, condensing, freezing, choking the carburetors. They had lost a tank crew 2 nights earlier because of it, burned alive on a road they never expected to be ambushed on. Nobody had connected the dots. Nobody wanted to. Troubleshooting meant delay, and delay meant death. A gust of frozen wind slashed through the camp, rattling the metal siding of the fuel truck. Dempsey pulled his collar higher, but the cold still bit into his skin. He tried to steady his breathing. Every inhale felt like it scraped against the inside of his throat. Somewhere near the east perimeter, a sentry coughed twice, the sound swallowed by the creaking branches overhead. The forest around the depot was unnervingly quiet, as if the war had exhaled and paused for a moment, waiting to see what the Americans would do next. Dempsey's boots crunched through a crust of frost as he walked toward Tank 7, the worst of the 3 damaged Shermans. Its nose pointed toward the narrow road that served as the column's lifeline. A dim lantern hung from a hook on the glacie's plate, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside the hull, Private Halverson sat hunched over the open engine compartment, rubbing his hands together for warmth. His breath drifted like smoke in the lantern glow. "Still frozen?" Dempsey asked, his voice low, gravelly. Halverson nodded. "Same as before. The line's solid ice. We melt it. It freezes again." "Sir, I don't think we can roll by dawn." Dempsey didn't answer. He knew the truth was far worse. Without those 3 tanks, the entire column was exposed. The Germans had moved faster than intelligence predicted, and every minute the Americans spent immobilized made them easier targets. If the 32nd didn't move by sunrise, they'd be caught in a pincer and flattened before breakfast. He leaned into the engine bay, the heat from the block flickering weakly against his face. He pulled off a glove and touched the fuel line. It felt like a frozen bone. He had tried everything: warming blankets, redirected coolant, even dropping the lines closer to the engine block to steal heat. Nothing held. Once the ambient air dropped below freezing, the moisture inside the auxiliary line crystallized again. The system had been designed in a warm weather plant in Michigan. Nobody thought about December in Normandy. A distant artillery boom rippled across the horizon. It wasn't close enough to be a threat, but close enough to remind them that dawn wouldn't wait. Dempsey closed his eyes for a moment, his temples pounding from lack of sleep. He thought of Corporal Haskins, the one they lost last week. A routine night transfer. Engine coughed once, then died. The Germans heard it before the Americans realized what happened. By the time Dempsey got there, the hull was a twisted black shell. He tried to pry the hatch open. The metal was too hot to touch. The smoke had smelled like burning canvas and motor oil and something worse that he never spoke about. Another memory flashed. The letter from home he had shoved into his jacket pocket but never opened. His wife's handwriting on the envelope. He had been too tired, too dirty, too overwhelmed to read it. The war had a way of demanding every part of you before you realized what you had surrendered. He forced his eyes open. Halverson was watching him, waiting for an answer he didn't have. Then, from somewhere behind them, a metallic thud echoed through the camp, a crate dropping on ice. The sudden noise jolted Dempsey awake, a micro-climax snapping him back to the present. His heart kicked against his ribs. The moment passed, but it left him alert in a way that felt unnatural after so much exhaustion. He turned back to the tank, tracing the frozen line with his fingers. Something didn't fit. If it was moisture in the line, why only these tanks? Why not the others? And why always after prolonged idling? He followed the curve of the line to the auxiliary intake port and stopped. The clamp holding the secondary line had a thin crescent of frost on only one side, where the airflow hit it directly from the cooling fan. A design oversight. A stupid, tiny, invisible flaw. Nobody had caught it because nobody looked at tanks this long without sleeping. Nobody except him. His breath formed a cloud in front of him as he stared. A trickle of clarity cut through the fog of exhaustion. Not enough heat was reaching that segment, because it wasn't insulated, not even by accident. The airflow hit it at the exact angle needed to pull warmth away instead of pushing it in. In cold conditions, the tank was effectively killing itself. He swallowed hard. Halverson watched him with a mixture of hope and dread. "Get me the scrap bin," Dempsey said quietly. Halverson hesitated. "The scrap bin? Now." The private sprinted toward the maintenance shed. Dempsey stepped back, feeling the cold bite deeper as he left the faint warmth of the engine. He rubbed his eyes again, fighting the urge to collapse right there on the snow. When Halverson returned, Dempsey rummaged through the bin. Discarded metal trimmings, torn insulation fabric, broken clips. He grabbed a strip of thermal wrap from an old exhaust kit. It wasn't meant for fuel lines. It wasn't regulation. And if anyone caught him modifying the Sherman without authorization, he'd face charges. But if he didn't do it, men would die by morning. He wrapped the auxiliary line with the thermal fabric using broken clips to secure it. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion. The lantern flickered. The forest creaked. Every sound felt amplified. Alive. "What are you doing?" Halverson whispered. "Buying time," Dempsey murmured. He tightened the last clip and stepped back. A breath he didn't realize he was holding slipped out in a cloud of white vapor. "Starter," he said. Halverson climbed into the hull. The starter whined, catching only after a long, painful groan. The engine rumbled to life. Dempsey leaned close, watching the line. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, slowly, the frost began to melt, not from direct heat, but from the absence of new ice. The airflow could no longer kill the line. Dempsey stared, heart hammering. It wasn't a solution. It was a patch, a desperate, improvised gamble. But it might be enough to save the entire column by dawn. The moment the frost retreated from the auxiliary line, Staff Sergeant Will Dempsey felt a tremor run through his exhausted body. Not excitement, not relief, but something rawer, something like fear, wrapped inside hope. The engine of Tank 7 settled into a steady growl, vibrations rolling through the frozen ground beneath his boots. Halverson leaned out of the hull, cheeks flushed from adrenaline or cold. Dempsey couldn't tell. "It's holding," Halverson whispered, as if speaking louder might break the spell. Dempsey didn't answer. He had learned long ago that machines were like men. The moment you trusted them blindly, they punished you for it. He watched the wrapped fuel line as if it were a wounded animal. A gust of icy wind cut through the camp, whipping snow into thin spirals that danced in the dim lantern light. The fabric held. No new frost formed. The line stayed warm enough to breathe. A distant crack echoed from the woods. Maybe a branch snapping under the weight of ice. Maybe something else. The night around them seemed to inhale sharply, as though aware that something had shifted, however small. Dempsey's eyes flicked instinctively toward the tree line, then back to the tank. He couldn't afford distractions. Not tonight. "Get Lieutenant Croft," he muttered. "Tell him we might have something." Halverson bolted toward the command tent, boots slipping on the icy ground. Dempsey stayed where he was, resting a hand against the side of the tank. The steel felt cold but not dead, not strangled by failure. It was alive again in a way he hadn't felt in days. A sudden memory surged forward without warning. The last time he touched a Sherman that felt this warm, Haskins' tank. The night before it went up in flames. He remembered joking with the corporal about how machines had tempers, how some Shermans woke up angry and stayed that way. Haskins laughed. A real laugh. The kind that sounded like home. The next night, the laughter turned into screams, drowned by roaring fire. Dempsey felt his jaw tighten until it hurt. The past didn't let go easily. Not out here. The command tent flap flew open, spilling yellow lamplight into the darkness. Lieutenant Croft stepped out, hunched against the cold, his helmet pushed slightly back on his head. He was younger than Dempsey by nearly a decade, but his eyes looked older in the flickering glow, eyes that had watched too many men die in too little time. Halverson followed, talking fast, pointing toward Tank 7. Croft approached with long strides. "Sergeant, I hear you've got something?" "Maybe," Dempsey said, forcing his voice steady. "I wrapped the auxiliary line. Rerouted some heat. It's improvisation. I don't know if it'll hold once we're moving. Croft leaned in, examining the crude insulation. The fabric was stained with oil and old soot. The clips didn't match. The whole thing looked like something a desperate man built in the dead of night to stop a bleeding he couldn't explain. Regulation doesn't cover this, Croft murmured. No, Dempsey replied. But neither does losing an entire column because of a design flaw some factory line worker never imagined. A wind howled through the trees, rattling the lantern violently. The flame inside flickered almost to extinction before stabilizing again. Croft stood up straight, exhaling slowly. His breath came out as a thick cloud. Start the others, he said. Dempsey blinked. Sir, you said 3 tanks are down. If this works on one, it might work on the others. Dempsey swallowed. He felt a sudden tightness in his chest. Sir, with respect, this isn't a fix. It's a miracle, Croft finished, eyes sharp. Or the closest thing to one we're getting tonight. Dempsey didn't argue. He simply nodded once, sharply, and headed toward Tank 11. The night deepened around them. Snow fell in slow, lazy flakes, the kind that looked harmless until they stacked into a white blanket that stalled engines and silenced roads. Above the depot, the clouds drifted in jagged layers, reflecting faint orange glows from distant artillery flashes. Somewhere to the north, machine guns rattled like metal teeth grinding in the dark. As Dempsey approached Tank 11, he heard frustrated voices inside the hull. 2 crewmen were arguing about whether they should start packing their personal items, just in case. Their fear clung to the air like static. He climbed onto the engine deck, boots scraping against frosted steel. Open up, he called, his voice harsher than he intended. The arguing stopped instantly. The hatch clanged open, and a sergeant with red-rimmed eyes stared up at him. Sir, we still dead? Not if I can help it, Dempsey said. Move. He didn't wait for permission. He slid into the cramped engine bay, working by feel as much as sight. The same ice buildup, the same angle of airflow, the same tiny oversight that could kill a man before he ever fired a shot. He pulled out his blade and cut a fresh strip of fabric from the thermal wrap. His fingers were numb, stiff, uncooperative, but he forced them into motion. Each time the metal clip snapped shut, he felt a dull ache shoot through his hand. He ignored it. A sudden crack split the air, louder than before. Someone in the distance shouted, "Hold your line." More voices rose. A second crack, then silence. The Germans were probing. Dempsey worked faster. Try it, he said, stepping back. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. He stared at the fuel line. No frost, not even a film. Another tank resurrected. Croft's voice carried from across the depot. Sergeant, one more. Dempsey nodded without looking up. Tank 3 waited at the far end, its tracks half buried in snow. It belonged to Lieutenant Ford, a man who barely spoke, who wrote letters home every night even when he had nothing new to say. His tank had broken down more often than most because Ford refused to let his crew idle engines longer than necessary. Saves fuel, he said. But tonight, keeping engines cold had been a death sentence. As Dempsey approached the third tank, fatigue hit him like a blow. His knees wobbled, his vision blurred. The edges of the world seemed to tilt slightly. He caught himself on the side of the hull, gripping the frozen steel until his fingers ached. He hadn't eaten since midday. He hadn't slept since the day before. And now, this forced clarity, this thin thread of possibility pulling him forward, it terrified him. A man who'd gone too long without rest started seeing patterns that weren't real. But this pattern was real. He knew it. He felt it in his bones. Ford poked his head out of the turret. Mechanic, if you've got anything left, now's the time. Dempsey climbed up, opened the engine access, and saw the same damned problem, staring back at him like a ghost he couldn't bury. He wrapped it, secured it, gritted his teeth when the wind sliced through his jacket again. When he finished, he stepped back and nodded. Ford started the engine. It caught instantly, cleaner than the other 2. The fuel line stayed warm. 3 tanks revived. 3 chances to live through dawn. Microclimax. A sudden whistle shot over the depot. An incoming shell that screamed low overhead and detonated somewhere behind the tree line with a hollow boom. Men ducked. Someone cursed. Snow shook loose from branches, drifting onto the tanks like ashes. Croft rushed over. Sergeant, this works. It works for now, Dempsey said. Doesn't mean it'll last. For now is all we need. Dempsey stared at the 3 running tanks. Their engines rumbled in harmony, shedding steam into the night. The sight felt surreal, almost impossible. Hours ago, They were frozen coffins. Now they were breathing again. He exhaled slowly. His breath trembled. "Sir," he said quietly, "we still have a column to save." The 3 revived tanks idled in the darkness like steel beasts pulling breath through their vents, their engines warming the frozen air in uneven waves. Staff Sergeant Will Dempsey stood among them, the vibration running up through his boots and into his bones. For a brief moment the rumble drowned out every other sound, the distant artillery, the crackling branches, even the quiet tremors of fear that had settled, night after night, into the men around him. But when the engines stabilized, their steady growl no longer felt reassuring. It felt like a countdown. Lieutenant Croft moved quickly, shouting instructions to the crews as the night pressed in around them. "Load your gear, tie down your packs, and get ready to roll," he barked, voice slicing through the cold air. "Column moves at 050. I want everyone in position before the horizon turns blue." The soldiers responded with a kind of exhausted obedience, moving with stiff limbs wrapped in heavy coats, their helmets dusted with fresh snow. Some clutched warm canteens. Others checked their weapons again and again, needing something to ground themselves in this unreal quiet before the inevitable storm. Dempsey rubbed his eyes, fighting a burning that wouldn't go away. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only fatigue so deep it felt like sand packed behind his ribcage. His hands trembled, the joints swollen from cold and strain. But he still scanned the 3 tanks, watching the improvised insulation, studying every pipe, every clamp, every breath of steam from the engine blocks. Improvisation saved machines, yes, but it also had a way of hiding its own failures until the moment they mattered most. A sharp whistle cut through the air, a sergeant's call from the far end of the depot. Dempsey turned to see a group of officers huddled around a map table illuminated by a single red lamp. The wind pushed snow across the maps, scattering the papers like fleeing birds. Croft motioned for Dempsey. "Sergeant." His voice carried a sense of urgency that made Dempsey's chest tighten. "Over here." Dempsey forced his legs forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the table, Croft pointed to a narrow valley on the map, a winding corridor shaded in pencil to mark tree density. "The Germans hit the 14th Regiment an hour ago," Croft said. "They're pushing harder than we thought. If we don't move the column before they regroup, they'll cut us off completely." Dempsey leaned over the map. His vision wavered. He blinked until the lines came back into focus. "This road," Croft said, tapping it, "is the only one that can handle the weight of the tanks. The others are frozen mud. You've seen the engines, they're barely holding. If they stall on an incline, we're done." Dempsey nodded slowly. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't trained for strategy. But he understood machines, and machines didn't care about maps or orders. They cared about pressure, temperature, timing, and all 3 were running out. "What you did," Croft continued, voice lower now, "might be the only reason this column survives the next 3 hours. Dempsey swallowed hard, the cold scraping at his throat. "Sir Martin, it was temporary. A bandage on a bullet wound. They'll run, but I can't guarantee how far. We'll take far over frozen in place," Croft said. "Just stay with the lead tanks. If anything starts to fail, you'll be there to address it." Microclimax. A sudden burst of rifle fire cracked from the direction of the perimeter, sharp and close. Men immediately crouched. One shouted, "Contact eastern tree line." Boots thundered against snow as a squad ran toward the noise. Then silence. A long, tense silence. Moments later, a voice called back, "False alarm, branch snap, no movement." But the dread remained. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting. Croft exhaled. "They're nervous." "So am I," Dempsey admitted. Croft didn't argue. Instead, he placed a hand on Dempsey's shoulder, something commanders rarely did. "Get something to eat if you can. Your hands are shaking." Dempsey looked down. The tremors weren't small. They were violent. He hid them by burying his hands in his pockets. "I'm fine," he lied. He wasn't. But he didn't have to be. He just had to keep the tanks moving. He turned away from the map table and walked toward the supply tent. The ground crunched under his boots. Frost formed spiderweb patterns across the tank's armor plates, glowing faintly under the lantern light. Men climbed onto their vehicles with groans and sniffles, fatigue making every movement deliberate. Inside the supply tent, a cook ladled lukewarm beef stew into tin cups. The smell hit Dempsey like a memory. Thick broth, salt, faint pepper. He grabbed a cup, steam rising weakly from the surface. He took a tentative sip. It scalded his tongue, but the heat spread down his throat like a small kindness. As he ate, he overheard 2 tank gunners whispering nearby. "You think the fix will hold?" It has to. Doesn't answer the question. It has to. The second repeated more quietly. Their fear settled into the air like powder ash. Dempsey closed his eyes for a moment. He wanted to say something reassuring, something human, something that acknowledged their terror while giving them strength. But the truth clung to the back of his tongue. He didn't know if the tanks would last 5 miles or 50. He left the supply tent and walked back into the cold. The engines continued to thrum, low and steady. Snowflakes gathered on his shoulders. His breath came out in ragged clouds. He checked the first tank again. Still warm, no frost. He checked the second, holding. He checked the third, stable. But he had seen machines betray men too many times to trust silence. He climbed onto Tank 7 once more, knelt beside the engine housing, and pressed his bare fingers to the insulated line. It was warm enough to survive, cold enough to remain dangerous. He whispered to no one, "Just get them through dawn." A voice called from behind him, "Sergeant, column briefing." He turned. Croft and the officers were gathering in front of the lead tank. Dempsey hopped down, landing harder than he expected, pain shooting up his ankle. He ignored it and forced himself forward. Croft addressed the crews, his breath forming clouds with every word. "Listen up, we move in 20 minutes. Snow is getting worse, visibility will be low. Keep lights off unless absolutely necessary. If the Germans hit us on the road, we push through. Do not stop unless the commander gives the order. These engines cannot afford hesitation." Dempsey felt dozens of eyes on him, though Croft hadn't named him. Everyone knew who brought the tanks back to life. Everyone also knew those fixes were untested under stress. A gunner raised his hand. What if the engines freeze again on the incline? Croft opened his mouth, but Dempsey spoke first. "If they freeze," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I'll unfreeze them, but they'll do better if you keep the RPM steady. Sudden throttle changes will make the frost fight back." The men nodded. They trusted him, more than he trusted himself. A rumble, deeper than artillery, rolled across the plains. It wasn't American. It wasn't distant. It felt like the ground itself shifting. Tank tracks, German ones. Croft met Dempsey's eyes. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They had minutes, maybe less. "Mount up," Croft shouted. "Let's move." Chaos turned organized in an instant. Men scrambled onto vehicles. Engines revved. Snow swirled under the sudden force of spinning tracks. Dempsey sprinted toward the lead tank, nearly slipping on the ice. His breath tore at his lungs. His body screamed for rest. His mind screamed for clarity. Neither came. He swung himself onto the side of the Sherman, grabbed the handrail, and hauled himself up onto the deck as the vehicle lurched forward. The column groaned as each tank shifted into motion, steel grinding against packed snow. Behind them, the forest exhaled a low, menacing growl. From engines, from men, from fate itself. No one could tell. But dawn was coming. And so were the Germans. The lead Sherman growled forward, its tracks grinding over the frozen earth as Staff Sergeant Will Dempsey clung to the side rail, the cold slicing into his exposed fingers. The column crept into formation. 5 tanks in front, infantry trucks tucked between them, 3 artillery carriers pulling up the rear. Snow whipped through the air in frantic spirals, the wind carrying a distant metallic echo that made every man on the convoy stiffen. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German armor was moving too. The forest swallowed the depot behind them, the darkness ahead thick and pulsing like a living thing. Dawn was still an hour away, but the sky had begun to shift into a bruised violet haze, a faint warning that time was running out. The tanks advanced slowly at first, engines straining in the cold. Dempsey leaned over the engine housing, watching the insulated line as if it were an exposed artery. The fabric fluttered in the wind but held firm, clinging to the steel like a last desperate prayer. Inside the turret, Lieutenant Croft's voice crackled through the crew intercom. "Maintain spacing, eyes forward, no stopping unless ordered. Repeat, no stopping." Dempsey felt the tank shudder beneath him as it began to climb the shallow incline ahead. This was the true test. The engines always failed under stress. Gravity pressed down on the machine, forcing it to work harder, hotter. He clenched the handrail so tightly his knuckles turned white through the dirt and grease. Halfway up the slope, a sharp hiccup jolted the engine. A sound like a metal cough echoed from the intake. Dempsey's heart lurched. He leaned in, pressing his palm flat against the insulated line. Warm. Not perfect, but warm. "Don't die on me now," he whispered. The engine roared again, stronger this time, like the tank had heard him and decided to obey. The Sherman pushed over the crest, treads biting into the frost, dragging itself and the men inside toward the narrow valley that separated them from safety. Then a thunderous crack split the winter air. Not artillery. A tank gun. The column froze for a blink. Dempsey swore he felt the sound before he heard it. A vibration through the steel, deep and sickening. A shell streaked through the trees ahead, slamming into the snowbank beside the second Sherman and erupting into a shower of earth and ice. Men ducked instinctively. Someone shouted orders drowned by the ringing in their ears. German armor. Closer than anyone realized. Croft's voice erupted through the intercom. Keep moving. They're testing range. Don't give them a stationary target. The tank surged forward, engines groaning. Dempsey gripped the rail as the Sherman lurched violently. Another shell screamed overhead, ripping tree branches into splinters. The forest came alive with falling snow and cracking wood, the world shaking as if the earth itself recoiled from the violence. The incline descended sharply now, forcing the tanks into a controlled slide. Dempsey ducked low as another shot tore through the air. This one closer, too close. Heat brushed his cheek as the round passed above him and detonated somewhere behind the convoy. A truck carrying ammunition veered off the road, tires skidding on ice. Dempsey saw two soldiers jump clear an instant before the vehicle tipped sideways and rolled into a ditch. A plume of steam burst from its radiator. Miraculously, it didn't explode. The tanks pressed on. The valley narrowed, trees crowding closer, branches scraping against armor. The darkness thinned as the horizon began to lighten with the first traces of dawn. Soft blue bleeding into black. The faint hue glinted off the snow, turning it into a ghostly sheet. Then the microclimax hit. Tank 11's engine coughed. A real one this time. Dempsey swung himself off the lead Sherman just as it slowed, boots skidding when he hit the ground. He sprinted toward Tank 11, the cold knifing into his lungs with each breath. The tank was stalled halfway through the valley, its engine rumbling unevenly. The insulation on its auxiliary line trembled under the growing strain. He leaped onto the rear deck, prying open the engine access with numb fingers. The heat inside blasted him with a wave of oily air. Frost had begun to form again at the far end of the wrap, the highest pressure point. Not much, but enough to kill them if it grew. "Come on," he rasped, tearing off a glove and pressing his bare hand over the weak spot. Pain shot through his skin, but the warmth from the engine spread through the fabric. Slowly, the thin crack of frost dissolved. Behind him, the valley thundered again as German guns fired another volley. The roar echoed like something ancient and furious. But Tank 11's engine surged back to life, stable again, breathing again. Dempsey banged the hatch twice. "Go!" The driver didn't hesitate. The Sherman lurched forward, tracks clawing through the snow. Dempsey ran alongside, grabbing the side rail and hauling himself up as the tank accelerated. His arms screamed in protest. His chest burned, but he refused to let go. By the time dawn finally spilled across the horizon, the armored column emerged from the valley onto open terrain. The Germans had fallen out of range. Their artillery ceased. Their engines faded into the forest behind them. The column slowed to a controlled crawl. Men looked around in disbelief. They were alive, shaken, frozen, exhausted, but alive. Dempsey collapsed against the side of the tank, chest heaving. Snowflakes settled on his oil-blackened skin. His hands throbbed from cold burns. His arms trembled uncontrollably. Croft climbed out of the turret, staring at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, not quite a grimace, something caught between relief and respect. "You saved them," Croft said. Dempsey shook his head, barely able to speak. "No, sir, I just kept the engines from quitting." Croft looked at the three Shermans. Their improvised insulation still wrapped like bandages around steel arteries. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "that's exactly what saving them means." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke into the early light. Dempsey stared at the horizon, where the first pale beam of sun touched the snow. No one would write his name in the reports. The fix would never appear in manuals. History wouldn't mention what he did in the last hours of that freezing night. But every man who rode out of that valley alive carried a silent piece of his defiance, stitched into steel, hidden under frost, beating inside engines that should have died before dawn. And that was enough.